Retired Lieutenant Colonel Garretson is an independent strategy consultant focusing on space and defense. He is a senior fellow in defense studies at AFPC, which, by the way, is the initials, but I can't actually think of what is the think tank? What's its name?
It's the American Foreign Policy Council.
Thank you. By the way, update your LinkedIn profile to say that, please. He served as a transformational strategist at the Air Force's Air University, the premier Air Force institution for strategy and policy education and concept development, and was director of the Space Horizons Task Force and deputy director of the Schriever Scholar Fellowship at the Air Command and Staff College. Lieutenant Colonel was previously the division chief of Irregular Strategy, Plans, and Policy. He has previously served as an Airpower strategist and strategic policy advisor to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force on his Strategic Studies Group, and 4 years on the Chief of Futures Technology for Headquarters Air Force Space. I'm used to saying that. Headquarters Air Force Strategic Planning. Recently, he was the publisher for Scramble for the Skies with yesterday's presenter, Dr. Namrata Goswami. And personally, I know that while he will never take public credit for it, he was very involved with the very beginnings of the modern version of what should be called Space Corps and is in fact called Space Force. So thank you very much, Peter. I'm going to turn the screen over to you. Thanks a lot, sir.
All right, let me bring it up. Michael had been kind enough to invite me to talk a little bit about what I think is a pretty exciting development, which is the release by Air Force Research Lab of a primer on CisLunar space. And I just want to be clear, that everything that I'm saying is purely my opinion. I am not representing AFRL or the Air Force or the United States Space Force. Okay, so you already heard about me. I think it is fair to say that I was an advocate of the Space Force and hopefully one of its intellectual fathers. And as he said, there's a book that covers many of the things that I think would interest this audience, including some scenarios about what could happen on the moon. Okay, so talking about the primer, which came out very recently. So you can download it on the AFRL Space Vehicles website. And AFRL Space Vehicles, you may not know, but it really is and should be called Space Force Lab. It is essentially the major science and technology component that feeds the Space Force. And so there is this wonderful video, by the way, that I'm not going to show, one AFRL 2 services on this website here. And in fact, it ends showing a flyby of the moon. AFRL is also the one that is doing really the only program in the United States on space solar power. And I should mention that they're doing all this on a shoestring budget. So first of all, many people don't realize that, and particularly you in the space advocacy community should be aware that the Space Force is just 2% of the total DoD budget. And it's 1/10 the amount of the others, of the Air Force, which is, the smallest department in terms of its budget. But of the S&T, which is this second to last, there's almost nothing going in it. It's 1/20th the level of the money going into aviation for the entire, space domain on the military side. And in fact, it's like half the amount that we're spending, certainly in aviation. So I think that if you like what they're doing, they could certainly use your support to grow that. And I think you should like it if I tell you how much they're paying attention. So I want to provide some context to this document. So first of all, I know I've heard many people sort of express, concern. Michelle has just talked about, what do we want the Space Force to do? And I think it's absolutely appropriate that NSS should take a guiding role. But, many people don't realize the Space Force was in fact birthed principally by these two men in Congress who had written the basic authorization long before it became unpopular with the Department of the Air Force and the Department of Defense, and then was initially rejected by the administration and then picked up by it. And so now we do have a Space Force, and it is codified in law. And this is what it says it's supposed to do. Provide freedom of operation for the United States, which includes all of you building moon colonies in, from, and to space, and to protect the interests of the United States, which includes your interests to the extent you're a US citizen or allied partner. Now, another key figure in sort of this development of thinking was in fact our former NASA administrator, who before that was a congressman. And he made this very interesting speech before he was NASA administrator, where he pointed out that constitutionally the US government is required to provide for the common defense, and that includes commercial assets, and that we need to be prepared to defend private and corporate rights and obligations, all in keeping with the Outer Space Treaty. And to enable freedom of action, the United States must have CisLunar situational awareness and CisLunar presence. So late in the last administration, this document that Michael brought up, the new era for deep space exploration and development, came out, which provided this grand vision of utilizing the surface of the moon and its resources, and developing a commercial economy for a sustainable presence on the moon, Mars, and beyond. And it has this tasking to the Space Force. So the White House level document, it says, look, the Space Force doesn't have a direct role in civil exploration, but its job is to ensure unfettered access and the use of space by the United States, its allies and partners, and its activities such as space transportation, logistics, power, communication, navigation, and space domain awareness are of dual use value to all space sectors, civil, national security, and commercial. And then about the same time, prior to actually this was slightly predates that, the Space Force had this get together, and in fact, Michael Lane had a starring role in sort of ensuring that the voice of the space advocacy community was there, and the new space community was there. And you can see its influence, right? So this was an official Air Force Space Command document thinking about the future of space. And it's very point blank. The US should establish space settlement and human presence as the primary driver for the nation's civil space program, and determine a path to large-scale human space settlement, like we just saw in the last presentation. And that we should assess civil space programs in terms of their utility to space settlement. Then it says that the US must commit to having a military force structure that can defend this international space order and American interests in space, including American space settlements and commerce. And it makes this cautionary note that in the world of 2060, space is going to be a significant engine of national, political, economic, and military power for those nations that organize for it, and that the Department of Defense is going to be a critical partner in this strategy and action plan, and therefore it needs to embrace its role as an executing agent of this national strategy, and that DoD programs need to be assessed not only in terms of their military utility, but their strategic utility to the national space strategy, and that the US military needs to define and execute its role in promoting, exploiting, and defending the expanded commercial and civil activities. So that was quite forward-leaning in terms of providing support. And then, we had another State of the Space Industrial Base that some of you may have participated in. And in there, they also took an advocacy position stating that with an increasing US presence and an expanded CisLunar economy will require security and stabilizing military presence, clarifying the US Space Force role in protecting and enabling US commerce across CisLunar is critical. And then at the bottom, they say a Space Force that presents capabilities, doctrine for national space power with clearly defined mission to enable and protect US commerce will project confidence and lower the perception of risk by providing stabilizing presence, surveillance, aid to navigation, and help when required. I should also note, right, that this is after Colonel McLean had published his paper, which was influential across the board, and you'll see that he's cited in other places as well. So the space power doctrine came out, and in the space power doctrine, they admitted that the entirety of economic and military space activities is confined to the geocentric regime. However, commercial investors in new technologies, meaning you, have the potential to expand the reach of vital national space interests to CisLunar regime and beyond the near future. By the way, it's important to recognize that we don't typically use the term vital national interests lightly. That typically means don't mess with us here. And a call to harmonize the instruments of national power. And then they defined a role or a mission called space security. That's a presence mission to assure partners, meaning you, that the military is positioned to monitor and protect your interests, such as protecting the lines of communication. And that's sort of a borrowing from the naval term. And you also saw this in Sean McLean's when he talks about he calls it CLOCs, or celestial lines of commerce, or celestial lines of communication. Okay, so then things started to actually happen on the bureaucratic side. So what we saw here was a memorandum of understanding between NASA and the United States Space Force, where they also, said that, hey, look, well, when they were established, the U.S. Space Force was tasked with defending and protecting U.S. interests. Till now, that's been inside of GEO, but with U.S. public and private sector operations extending into CisLunar space, the reach of the U.S. Space Force's sphere of interest will extend the full volume of CisLunar, a 1,000-fold expansion. So I want you to just realize how seriously the Space Force is taking your project. And they list a bunch of cooperative areas on here, of which the most important is this deep space space domain awareness, or at least the most important to this document. Okay, so then very late last year, a new space policy came out, and very importantly, it said the Secretary of Defense shall. Now, in the Department of Defense, shall is very strong language. It means you will absolutely do this. There's no wiggle room to get out. So it says the Secretary of Defense, and of course that would be executed through the Space Force and U.S. Space Command, will defend the use of space for United States national security purposes, the United States economy, meaning you, allies and partners, that it will protect freedom of navigation and preserve lines of communication that are open, safe, secure in the space domain. Those are your lines of commerce to CisLunar, and that they are tasked to detect, characterize, warn, attribute, and respond in coordination with the Department of State and others, space-related behaviors and activities that threaten the space interests of the United States, its allies, partners, international peace and security, or the long-term sustainability of the space environment. Okay, so leaning into this, the Air Force Research Laboratory leadership, and a number of them, authored this article in the New Space Force Journal, which I encourage all of you to read. It's got these awesome, just beautiful artwork by Vaughn, who's just fantastic. And of course, in this article, we were basically making the case that the United States military must undertake the necessary preparations to secure interests beyond GEO, and that as U.S. space activities, meaning you, expand into deep space, threats to economic and security interests are likely to emerge, and it makes that case. And that the technical challenges of operating beyond GEO, because there are such technical challenges, it's going to take some lead time to get this going, and so you have to begin to invest now. Now, when this article was written, the primer was initially supposed to be part of an appendix to the article, basically supplying additional technical detail, but it became clear to the AFRL Space Vehicles leadership that this really deserved to be its own standalone document with a slightly different audience. So, the real kudos to this document go to the two visionary leaders, Colonel Eric Felt and Captain David Bueller. David Bueller had been one of the ones who had conceptualized this idea of the CisLunar Highway Patrol, sort of pictured here at right, this idea that we, would establish a presence out there to do exactly what we were tasked to do, to monitor CisLunar space. And the actual document, the technical aspects were written by M.J. Holzinger and C.C. Chow, who are experts in the field of orbital dynamics and sensing. So this is what Air Force Research, Air Force Research Lab Space Leadership said about it. Colonel Felt said that the document aims to educate and inspire. He said that as commerce extends to the moon and beyond, it's vital that we understand and solve the unique challenges so that we can provide space domain awareness and security. And Dr. Hammett said, if you look at the National Space Strategy that was signed in December, it actually commits the Space Force and the Department of Defense to monitoring what is going on out there. And if somebody's a bad actor in the international realm, to monitor, detect, and respond. So what is actually in this? Well, the primer itself says that it aims to familiarize the reader with CisLunar space. It's targeted not principally at you, but you might find it quite interesting. It's targeted at military space professionals who have to develop plans, capabilities, and expertise, and to provide them with sort of the first level entry of a technical discussion about what's actually going on. You can see it makes reference to all the documents that I just laid out for you in front. And it's basically trying to build just a basic understanding of what is a complicated environment and to provide foundational terminology. So, I think you've heard multiple times sort of this discussion of the blue versus brown water. And of course, navigation, is very different in a riverine or coastal environment than navigation when you're out in the middle of the ocean. And in the same way, the navigation that you need for CisLunar space is different once you sort of leave the shores of Earth. So here's the contents of it. There's an overview of the dynamics. There it talks about that, and you can see that this is principally focused on the space domain awareness mission as well as keeping track of things. So there's an overview of the dynamics. They talk about the challenges to observation, and they talk about spacecraft operations. So here are some of I realize that this is a mixed audience, so I want to keep it at a level that's going to interest everyone. So the key takeaways are, look, the volume is huge and extends to at least, 2 million kilometers, unless you're very close to Earth and basically inside the Warden line. I will put in a slide since that was asked of me. Trajectories are not circular, elliptical, or even planar. And this is important because, to educate the planners and operators, today they are used to using two-line elements in order to describe the trajectories of spacecraft. So two-line elements are not sufficient in the CisLunar area. And so you have to come up with an entirely different coordinate system than is currently used for space situational awareness and keeping custody of things. So of course, they recognize and explain what the special points in the Earth-Moon system that allow for nearly stationary frames. And they talk about, that there are also zones where you can define what are the dominant forces that are acting. And then they provide that there are infinite closed orbits exist. They're organized into particular families, that there are neighboring exotic quasi-periodic orbits, where multiple revolutions exist. So, it talks a little bit about cyclers. It talks a lot about these different families of orbits. Got some really cool graphics in it, some original, some borrowed from other important documents. But very importantly, all trajectories in this domain are unstable. And some are much more unstable than others, but essentially the butterfly chaos effect is always in effect. So when we talk about operations, you're always having to maneuver, but although the maneuver is extremely small. So, they talk about, just how far it is, that essentially if you're measuring in terms of distances, in terms of geo, L1 is already, out, 7 times geo. The moon is at 9 times geo. And then you've got these zones, you've sort of got this Earth dominant zone, then you've got this moon gravity dominant zone, and then you've got this sort of shared space where all kinds of things can happen that are chaotic and crazy. So then they go into the key takeaways in terms of keeping track of things. And so detection is much more difficult. Objects are fainter because of the longer distances. It really stresses remote sensing capabilities because objects are moving so much slower. You have to take many more observations in order to see if they're moving. And that means that if you did have a malactor, they could surprise you in ways because there's such a large volume, and very, very tiny changes can have a huge impact on where they're ending up. It's also extremely difficult for Earth-based sensors or even near Earth-based sensors to see the moon due to its brightness. And then because of the different rates of rotation, you have periodic difficulty in observing. So, objects are not stationary like they are when we look at the other far out objects in geo, which is what most of the Space Force personnel would be familiar with. And of course, no single ground-based sensor can maintain continuous coverage. So it's going to require asymmetric data strategies. They go over, what special natural orbits might offer better vantage points. They talk about the utility of the Lagrange points from perspective, and they basically talk about passive electro-optical system, meaning telescopes. And then due to the perturbation of the moon, there are few repeating natural orbits that provide the real estate for placing sensors. And so bottom line of these authors is that passive electro-optical systems, telescopes, have substantial utility. Active ranging, like LiDAR, probably not going to be as useful, or at least not as useful in the same size and packaging of a small satellite. Passive RF systems, also useful. Active RF systems, meaning radar, also face sort of the power and the fall off of going out and then coming back and reflection. So this was not in the report now. So just transitioning to the question that I heard Michael asking Sean about the Warden line. So this is a phrase coined by Matt Daniels after an insight provided by Dr. Warden, who we heard. And I should just mention that almost all of this work in some way tracks back to the mentorship of Pete Warden. I don't think there's probably anything truly revolutionary or cool in the United States space portfolio that Pete hasn't had his hand in some manner in mentoring in some way. But I think this is going to be covered more in their forthcoming book, American Spaceflight. But essentially what it is that somewhere here, just before 3 times geostationary orbit, about 100,000 kilometers altitude above Earth, this is where sort of the chaotic inputs change. You're no longer in the protected shoals of Earth, and maneuver is much easier. You can get into resonance orbits that could, completely throw you out completely. And so, you can deliberately use those, for changes. And so this is a graphic from a forthcoming piece that I yet to be published. But if these things interest you, I've written, quite a bit about, what the Space Force's role, should be, and why the moon's important, and, what this, might look like in the future. And if you're interested in seeing, what we've talked about in terms of how the Space Force should take on planetary defense and how they're underfunded for, protecting commerce, there are 2 places. And then, of course, we cover a lot of this, Namrata and myself, in the book about how great powers are starting to compete for these resources because they think it will alter the balance of power. and we talk about, how you could move from today to a crisis around 2047 that could completely determine, what the future of humanity might look like, all in this sort of competitive vision to use lunar mining to grow the global economy using solar power satellites. And we talk about a lot of situational scenarios, claim disputes, trafficking, unsafe practices, piracy, how all these might play out. And then the last thing I'll just say, I run a space strategy podcast where we talk about these things with some really terrific folks. So please think about listening in to hear, how we're talking about space and the economy. So that concludes my talk.
Thank you so much. Once again, it's drinking from the fire hose. There's just so much there. The very first thing in my private chat is that James Burks is like, we need Pete's deck. So you guys send over your slides, please. Send it to me and I'll make sure we get it posted right away. There's so much there, right? I tried posting to the chat all of the reference documents. I don't know if I caught all of them, but I caught a lot of them. I'm going to summarize and say it's a fast-moving target. Like the world of space that moved super slow over like decades, all of a sudden in the last 3 years, I'd say, has changed really fast. That the DoD sees it in a very different light. They are beginning to see the moon in a different light, and they are expanding their, let's say, sphere of influence to beyond the moon. Is that all true? Does that seem true to you?
Certainly there are indications of that, I think important indications. I still think, and probably rightfully so, the balance of investment remains close to Earth where, the major economic and strategic interests are. But we're nowhere near in the same world we were a year or two ago.
No.
And I think you're seeing more and more of the younger generation that just, take this for granted. They've come up in a different way. They think in a different way. And so I expect you'll see this continually expressed, more and more. It is, I talked about it being a battle for the soul of the Space Force, but there's a lot of evidence that it's on the road to salvation. So
very nice. Madhu asked a question. So now, how does policy translate into action? Assume glacially as always? Question mark. I'm going to say I don't think that's true, but please answer however you like.
Well, what I would say is that it sort of depends on who you think is the key actor. I tend to think that really it is the private sector that's going to be the driver. Of course, government has to play its role of creating the market. It's necessary, that at least the initial anchor, and that's going to be a struggle, but we're going to get a lot of help. I mean, I'll be honest, China is being extremely helpful right now in both US and, global spacefaring. So, it is their initiative that we are responding to. I don't think we would even have an Artemis program at all had there not been the Chang'e landing on the far side. And so, I think that I don't see that slowing down, and I don't see the United States congressional leadership wanting the United States to surrender its lead. And so if that means that we're essentially committing ourselves to another, it's not exactly the right word to say space race, because there's no one destination. Namrata and I in our book use the word scramble, that there are many things to go after, but what is insufficient business left undone from the last administration, and hopefully will be taken up by this one, is we really still don't have the kind of clarity of a North Star vision about what we're going to do. And I'll be very specific about what I think is missing. So we need clarity on industrial targets for our lunar industrial facility. We should call it a lunar industrial facility. We shouldn't call it an outpost. We should be very clear about, what it is. And we need to know, in my view, China's thrown down the gauntlet in the most appropriate and terrific way, which is that they have, their vision of the lunar industrial development, is to create a, $10 billion annual moon Earth economic zone where they've industrialized the moon to build solar power satellites.
Right.
And, and so that should be, a focus of the sort of research that we are paying our corporate partners on the moon to do. They should be, like, how do we get to 90% of the mass of a solar power satellite using lunar materials? And let's make sure we're doing it on a comparable timeline. And by the way, one of the slides I did not show is that the US-China, let me see if I can steal back the screen share for just a second to show a few more things related to this.
Well, while you're doing that, I'm going to tell a quick story. I was, very coincidentally, I was in Building 1 at Air Force Space Command. It wasn't Space Force yet. At Air Force Space Command, 3 days after China landed on the far side of the moon. And you can bet that was a conversation that was going on. And I do think that, that was a wake-up call. That was an important wake-up call moment. So, all right. So, share, and to answer Madhu's question, are things moving glacially? No, I absolutely do not think they're moving glacially. There is a lot of stuff happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, AFRL is doing other really cool things. They're looking at how you could get, precision GPS out in CisLunar, and then I know other parts of AFRL, the sort of AFWorks, SpaceWorks, is thinking about all kinds of other cool things that are, sort of in the SBIR, small business innovative research realm. But, as much as they like to have their own NIAC, right? And NIAC's cheap. I think it's like 2 or 5 million. It's not much, right? Yeah. Keep in mind, the entire Space Force S&P budget, whatever I showed there, like 130K, 130 million. Yep. That's just tiny. So anyway, you saw Namrata's presentation, mostly focused on the moon, but her earlier presentation on China was very influential on this particular report by the US-China Economic and Security Commission. And one of their recommendations at the end was to ensure that US Space Command and any future space-oriented service, meaning what would become the Space Force, are responsible for protecting freedom of navigation and keeping the lines of communication open, safe, and secure in the space domain, as the Navy does in the interest of the maritime domain. And that got translated into this, which is now law. So the last year's, or I guess this year's National Defense Authorization Act says the National Space Council shall submit to the appropriate congressional committees an interagency assessment of the ability of the United States to compete with the space programs of China, including a comprehensive assessment of the United States and China on human exploration and spaceflight. Here's the kicker: the viability and potential environmental impacts of extraction of space-based precious metals, on-site exploitation of space-based natural resources, and the use of space solar power. And I will point out that this is yet to be done. So to the extent that your community wants to weigh in, keep in mind that what they end up saying will be influential to others. So if you have data showing, hey, it's viable in these particular ways, you want to make sure that you're broadcasting that because there will certainly be plenty of naysayers. They also ask for an assessment of the strategic interest in and capabilities in CisLunar space, and an assessment of the ability of the Department of Defense to the ability, role, cost, and authorities of the Department of Defense to mitigate threats to commercial, which I thought was quite interesting.
Pete, I've not actually seen the language of that one, so you and I are going to have to talk about that one when this is over.
You're not seeing my slide?
No. I'm saying I've not seen this language before. So I have not read that document. No, we're seeing you fine. We're seeing you fine.
By the way, I do want to say that, again, this is from a yet to be published thing, but this outer ring that goes through the L points, EML 3, 4, 5, and the moon, it is what all of us have started to refer to as the McLean line, because he, pulled that out. And it's really more of the McLean torus because the donut actually goes, encompasses the EML 1 and 2 points. And, this gets into, how is this space economy, like, and again, I want to make sure that this is from a forthcoming paper. This is not from the primer. You won't find this in the primer. But when you think about what are the lines of commerce that could, develop over the long term, you've got these green rings that showcase, the profit centers in Geo and Leo, and, smaller profit centers in EML 1 and lunar orbit. And then you've got these red lines, which are your, your lines of communication. So you've got, one thing where you're, putting out capital, assets like factories and mining gear outbound and people, and then you're also returning people via this Apollo clock. I prefer clock rather than C-lock.
Me too.
And then, you've got these lines of commerce that move, between the lunar surface to EML 1, whether that be by, rockets, or whether that be by a lunar space elevator. And then you've got, the mass movement of materials off the moon, either via, a space elevator or via, a mass driver. Typically, the old L5 concept was to shoot them out to EML2, and then from EML2, you move them either to what I call the Glaser clock for solar power satellites after Peter Glaser.
Nice.
Or via the O'Neill clock onto EML5.
Okay.
So that's kind of what might things look like.
I hadn't seen those named O'Neill and Glaser. That's a nice touch.